Welcome back. The United Nations Security Council is increasingly viewed as outdated and unrepresentative of the world's community. I spoke earlier with former Secretary General Boutros Ghali about the future of the UN and the best ways to reform the international organization. But first, a quick review of the proposals to reform the UN.
In principle, everybody yearns for change.
There is absolute need to reform the Security Council, and we have to do it quick.
It's been necessary for many years.
It doesn't reflect the realities of today's world.
But in practice, nothing has changed.
Everybody has a different idea of what reform is. For most of the people in the world who worry about the Security Council at all, reform means how do you make it more effective? How do you stop Bosnia happening? How do you stop Rwanda happening? How do you stop Darfur happening? For the Permanent Five, reform is how can we make things look respectable while we keep all of our old privileges?
Today's formula has the 5 veto-wielding permanent members, China, France, Russia, UK and the United States, and 10 elected members for 2-year terms, but with no real power.
This Security Council is paralyzed. You need new members to come in to address some of these issues that are very critical to the world, that are going unaddressed, because these 5 people have run out of ideas.
My feeling is that they know they also need a more legitimate, more effective, more inclusive Security Council.
Today's structure has been frozen for 6 decades and does not relate to the challenges of today's world. Its distorted form of representation stands between us and the multilateral world to which we aspire.
The so-called Group of 4, made up of India, Brazil, Germany and Japan, represents a new force at work, demanding greater influence to reflect their global power.
And that met huge opposition, both regionally from regional neighbours, but also from other countries who felt themselves to be equally entitled or equally important.
Critics say that it will be nothing more than new players representing their own self-interest.
Frankly, if you have India on the Security Council, it's not going to represent Asia, it's going to represent India.
There is another collection of countries nicknamed the Coffee Club. They are determined to keep the great powers in check.
For example, Pakistan is resolutely opposed to India, and they can stop the necessary majority for making changes in the UN Charter.
The largest bloc of underdeveloped countries is in Africa. They desperately need and are demanding a permanent voice on the Security Council.
Africa needs to be there, particularly because we are the ones who are facing all these challenges of international peace and security.
Despite all the pleas, reforming the UN Security Council has been bogged down with infighting and self-interest. But many believe it's too important to give up.
And of course, those who want to secure new permanent membership have tried to take hostage any other reform of the Security Council.
Reforming the UN cannot be a lost cause. We need the Security Council.
Mr. Ghali, as part of the reforming the United Nations, there are proposals out there to increase the number of the permanent members of the Security Council, adding more powerful members to the already existing 5 powerful members. Do you think that will add to the effectiveness or to the just operation of the Security Council?
Look, I disagree with this kind of approach. For me, the problem is not to increase the number of the member state of the Security Council. My approach is different. I believe that we need the participation in the United Nations system of the non-state actors. It is not small reform by adding 2 members or 4 members in the Security Council or having a control of the veto which will change. We are living a new era which need the presence of new actors in the United Nations system.
The problem with that, Mr. Ghali, is that there is no will on the part of superpowers to make such a change.
The will don't exist today, but it will be, they will be compelled to accept it in the next few years, we will be confronted by new global problems. The problem of environments, the problems of water, the problems which are completely new, which was not existing 10 and 20 years ago, the problems of failed states. So those are new problems which was not existing when the United Nations was created.
Is there at least a possibility for the United Nations to have a bigger capacity to prevent conflicts, or at least to police post-conflict areas?
No, I'm sorry, I'm pessimist. I believe that the United Nations will continue to be a weak organization. And the main solution have to be found outside the framework of the United Nations. Why? Because the United Nations have not changed. The United Nations was created in 1945 with 50 countries. The United Nations was created on the base of the sovereign state. This have changed. So the United Nations, if the United Nations want to play a new role, it must change, taking in consideration the technological revolution, taking in consideration the fact that you have new non-state actors who are more powerful than the majority of the member states of the United Nations.
That's quite a challenge for the future, Mr. Ghali. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Next, I'll discuss the new challenges facing the UN Security Council with Steve Clemens and James Straub. But first, a report on rape and other cases of widespread abuse in today's world.
Once upon a time, international wars were fought on battlefields and along contested borders. Now, wars are fought on new, more intimate front lines.
Wars are not fought on battlefields anymore. They're fought from house to house. They're fought on the basis of ethnic conflict and intra-regional conflict, and civilians are increasingly targeted.
As the nature of war changes, so does the UN Security Council's role in demanding international peace.
The Council's original role was to deal with interstate conflict and weapons of mass destruction and proliferation of these kinds of weapons. The weapons that are hurting people now are landmines, cluster bombs, and small arms, as well as widespread mass systematic sexual violence.
Such brutal violence led the UN Security Council to adopt Resolution 1820, the responsibility to protect, recognizing sexual violence as a military tactic and as a war crime.
When women and girls are preyed upon and raped, the international community cannot be silent or inactive. It is our responsibility to be their advocates and their defenders.
Ili saa juu kutetemeka ilikuwa mingi na kulia ilikuwa mingi, hatukujua kama kila mtu yuko anapenda mwenzake atoke na aingie.
Nilikuwa kama nachukua nani yule mguu akakia kunifinya hapa, ndio alinitomba.
We have reports of very brutal rape in excess of 200,000 cases. And we know that that is but the tip of an iceberg. Can you imagine a sustainable, peaceful resolution to a conflict where hundreds of thousands of women are being subjected to what can only be called a brutal form of sexual terrorism by armed men?
The thing about sexual violence is that it has been thought of as a women's problem. It has been addressed through humanitarian measures and through work to empower women. What Resolution 1820 does, and its significance, is that it frames sexual violence as a security problem and a political problem.
But there is skepticism about how and when the UN Security Council might use its new power to act within sovereign countries in protection of human rights.
A number of member states fear that the concept of the responsibility to protect will be invoked to justify what is in effect aggression.
As we learned in Iraq, the best way to restore the confidence of the people is to restore basic security. And that requires more troops.
The question that many states have raised in the debate around the responsibility to protect is, can we be confident that it will be raised in the context of Gaza just as it is in the context of Darfur? Can we be confident that it will not be used to advance the particular agenda of a powerful member state?
James Straub, you've written a book about the United Nations in an era of an American power. Boutros Ghali, the former Secretary General, thinks that this United Nations is not going to be able to deal with those challenges we've just seen around the world. He thinks a third generation United Nations is needed, something that's just not a question of adding members, but having a completely different mandate to include completely non-state actors. What's your view on that?
I think that so many of the problems the world faces today require that we have actors beyond just states. Now, a fair question is, should the body that includes those people be the United Nations, or should that be other kinds of bodies? So take, for example, an issue like climate change. You can't only solve climate change among states. I mean, if you think about the bodies that have existed so far, scientists, investors, NGOs, and so forth. So I think it's absolutely right that in the international architecture of the future, we will not simply have these state-to-state bodies. I don't know whether the United Nations itself will become the place where all of these states and non-state actors come together. I'm not convinced that's the case.
And it's actually being sidelined nowadays more and more by the likes of, for example, the G8 or the G20 or NATO for that matter.
Clearly that is so. Is that a bad thing? Or are we moving into a world where we have a kind of constellation of bodies? The UN, the biggest, brightest one at the center, but regional bodies like the African Union or NATO, largely economic bodies like the Bretton Woods ones, these convenings, the convening fora like the G8, the G20, that world of kind of multiplicity of institutions is what the world I think will increasingly look like.
Steve, the Secretary General of the United Nations, Mr. Ban Ki-moon, just told us at the opening session that an 18-year-old rape victim in Congo should actually expect to be defended in the future by the United Nations. Do you think that's at all feasible?
I think with the way the United Nations is structured today, it's not feasible at all. And we often have people that are part of the culture and the institution of the United Nations who feel as if there are great causes and greater causes than they can struggle with today that this should be directed to. But ultimately, you're dealing with the will or the will not to participate of major states. And to some degree, that 18-year-old victim in Congo may get lucky if there's a powerful state that makes it on that agenda.
Here you have a question, for example, in Darfur, that it's almost common knowledge it's the Chinese that will veto any further actions on the question of Darfur and Sudan. On other questions, it's the Russians. In certain questions, it's the United States. It's always those superpowers that keep wielding their veto power in order to make sure that certain things do happen or do not happen. Do you think there's a way out of this, Steve?
I'm somewhat more cynically disposed. I don't believe that we can walk away from the fact that you've got large blocks of power that must be essentially organized to be the stewards of the international system as we move forward. And they can use that power in proactive, constructive ways, or they can withhold it as they see, given the other dynamics of the international system. That's how it was organized. But I do agree that what you'll see is sort of a lot of the action that is now trapped in the UN essentially moving to other institutions. But I don't believe the permanent structure in the Security Council is going to give up that power until there's some major shipwreck in the international system.
What do you think about this whole optimism now that the United States is more or less rejoining the international community under President Obama, very different, contrasted with his predecessor, George Bush's approach to the United Nations?
What we've all learned over the previous 8 years was America's capacity to do harm to the international system. I think Obama quite rightly recognizes America's capacity to do good to the international system, but that requires the willingness to take really painful steps. And so I think his focus on non-proliferation is going to encounter a lot of opposition in this country. But Obama recognizes that there's no way he's going to be able to make the demands he wants to make of others unless the United States says that promise we made in the non-proliferation treaty to move towards the elimination of nuclear weapons, we mean it.
But the Russians and the Chinese, as well as the Americans, said in the first 2 days of this session, the 64th session, that they're all for and will be supportive of reducing, in fact, taking over for completely of nuclear weapons.
With all due respect to those statements that have been here that I largely support, and I think that rhetorical convergence has its value, it's not dissimilar from things China and Russia have said in the past.
Cynical? It's just cynical?
No, I don't think it's that easy to discount, but I think that President Obama's very, very dedicated effort to try to draw these people into some genuine effort at revitalizing and changing the way we look at and manage non-proliferation and the problem of there is a bit of convergence there, but there is this state competition that continues. We're helping proliferation actually with India and doing some things with the UAE, which are legal in the NPT sense, but yet still raise alarm bells.
Looking the other way when Pakistan develops, or if Israel has.
That's right. I mean, we live in a world where we've got to get our heads and brains and creativity around how to revitalize that nuclear non-proliferation regime, because in my view, during the 8 years of the Bush administration, we not only didn't tend this, we actively tried to undermine that. We had people in the United States who were opposed to international institutions and international agreements that they felt bound America's freedom to move. And we're now at a point coming back and trying to restore equilibrium to some sane approach to the nuclear question. And I think China and Russia at this point see that largely they're in their interest, but it would be a mistake to think we're on the same page.
We heard speeches from the Chinese leader, the Russian president, the American president. They almost sound alike. James, I'll quote you something that the Chinese leader said. He wants to support trade, he wants to combat terrorism, he wants to help the poor, he wants to take greater responsibility in international affairs. Same thing with the Russian leaders. He wants interfaith dialogue, he wants capitalism to work better. What is going on in the world? All the superpowers now are in agreement?
No, this is just talk is cheap. I mean, the General Assembly session is designed for states to say these nice things, to put sugar coating on their national interests. So I wouldn't take that too far. I mean, clearly there's some questions, for example, that have to do with the global economy, where these painful ideological issues we're talking about really don't arise. And it's frankly a lot easier to have these conversations in the IMF than it is to have them in the UN Security Council, because everybody kind of wants the same thing, even if it's a zero-sum game. So I don't, alas, see that coalescence at all. And I think right now, in an odd way, we have returned almost to the Cold War division that paralyzed this institution and which we thought had come to an end in 1989. So many issues today pit the United States, the UK, and France against Russia and China, even though that it's really not about the Cold War. That moment is over, but competing views of national interest, competing values, competing senses of the international system continue to pit the one side against the other.
Do you think this Security Council is capable of dealing with those new challenges out there that are not state-based as it is based today?
Well, I look at the UN and particularly the Security Council as a unique stage and theater for the rest of the world. What it can do is raise the critical importance of issues and then begin looking not only here, but then in institutions like the G20 or other institutions around the world about how they might coordinate to deal with some of these problems. The UN Security Council is the most powerful convening in the world. And there's a tendency of those who look at the UN to say, why can't this powerful convening handle all the problems we care about? And I think that overloads the ability of that essentially very conservative, somewhat global stabilizer, if you will, that actually has all these mechanisms of check and balance of not moving. It's a very conservative global institution. While John Bolton wouldn't agree with me calling it a conservative institution, but it is an institution that's designed almost not to be completely effective. And so you look for other ways in which to raise an issue, and if you see a nation or state stake out a claim against something that's in the global interest, the world sees it, it almost helps legitimate moving it out of the UN. That's why I think we need a very rich array of different kinds of more flexible institutions around the world, while I'll always think we'll have a rather inflexible but powerful institution in the middle.
James, do you think with this new environment today, post-Bush administration, with what you've seen from this session, do you think there is more hope in the future?
There is more hope, but several things you cannot
You find it very difficult to say it.
No.
He's hopeful.
I'm a hopeful person in general, but I'm so aware of how poisoned the atmosphere has been, and I would say continues to be in the UN. So if you say that's because of the Bush administration, and I would agree that's a big part of it, the point is that kind of poison takes a long time to leach out. And then we have just the deep clashes of interest that we've been talking about. And so the whole question of the relationship between rising powers and the existing power structure, which the UN is simply a cockpit for, is going to be a huge problem. And exactly how that's managed and through which institutions, and as we've been saying, the UN is only going to be one of them, this is a thing we're going to see being worked out over the course of the coming years.
Well, on this hopeful note, gentlemen, James, Steve, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you.
And I'll be back with a last note. You probably never heard of President Mohammed Nasheed before this week, which explains why his sharp and passionate speech at the UN Climate Change Summit has gone unnoticed. His small island country, the Maldives, will probably go under, physically go underwater sometime this century if the trend in climate change isn't reversed. Other islands and many coastal cities around the world would follow with disastrous human and economic costs. To avoid such catastrophes, industrial nations must reduce emissions 40% by 2020 and 80% before mid-century, which will require serious investment in green economy. The good news, if they invest $170 billion annually, their payoffs could reach $8 trillion by 2020. Joining President Nasheed at the podium were US President Obama and China's Hu Jintao, whose nations produce a high 40% of the world greenhouse gas emissions that cause global warming. Only they can, and therefore must, lead by example ahead of the Copenhagen Climate Change Summit to be held in December. Thank you for watching.